Welcome to the Real Estate Espresso Podcast, your morning shot of what's new in the world of real estate investing. I'm your host, Victor Menashe. This is the weekend edition where we have a very special show for you today. It's not our usual real estate show. Today we have the story of what's happening in California with the wildfires that have been making headlines all over the nation. All the way from Sebastopol, California, welcome to the show, Adam Taggart.
Welcome, Victor. It's an honor to be here.
Great to have you here, Adam. I know it's been a difficult week for you. You were evacuated from your home along with 180,000 of your closest friends. What was that like?
Well, it was chaotic. Let me start with the good news where, and maybe this isn't such great news, but we are getting used to this drill up here in Northern California. 2 years ago, our area was ravaged by the Tubbs fire. And that fire ended up being a lot more destructive in the end in terms of structures burned and sadly lives lost. So this one, there were many fewer structures burned at the end of the day, and very happy to say there were no lives lost. So despite the stress, the anxiety, and the inconvenience, we're all considering ourselves very lucky at this point.
Well, and I'm very glad to hear that. You know, certainly the images from 2 years ago were heart-wrenching, to say the least. The dislocation to the thousands of folks that lost their homes, not just in the Tubbs fire, but in the many fires that were part of that year's fire season, was enormously destructive. Of course, you know, right now the headlines are all focused on Southern California, not so much on Sonoma County, but what's happened in Sonoma is still, it's a big deal. It's a lot of acreage that's been lost. And one of the things that comes to mind, of course, yourself and Chris are the principals and founders of Peak Prosperity, an organization that is focused on what to do when things go wrong and make sure that you've set up your life in a manner that you can be resilient. So now you're having not only talk about it in a theoretical sense, you're experiencing it firsthand. What's that been like?
Yeah, that is very true. And these fires are definitely reminders from the universe on the importance of cultivating resilience in your life. They really put all your planning to the test. But seriously speaking, it is a real reaffirmation of the importance of preparation in building that kind of flexibility and adaptability into your life. And I'll give you a couple of examples of why that was so important. One is somebody who writes a lot about preparation and not just emergency preparedness, but being prepared for a whole number of different potential outcomes in life. And that's really the core of what resilience is. It's no matter what life throws at you, your ability to bounce back to it, to your adaptability is as high as possible. Understandably, I've got a pretty good bug out plan at my house for almost any type of situation. And so being able to leave the house at a moment's notice, that's something I'm very well prepared to do. And again, just to reference the Tubbs fire 2 years ago, there were a lot of people who had literally seconds to leave their house, seconds of notice. Somebody was pounding on their door at 3 a.m., telling them that they had to run now for their lives. And in those cases, you've got really no ability to think or really take any action. You just have to get in the car and run. Given my background, I'm very well prepared to do that. In this case, the signal the universe sent me personally was that you can have your plans in place, but things can still go down in a manner where you can't put into action the plan that you've prepared for. So in my case, my oldest child had just started her freshman year at college, and my wife and I were down there for Parents' Weekend. So when the evacuation warning started coming out, we were 300 miles away from our house. So we had to figure out what to do with that distance between us. And we decided that we eventually needed to leave our time with our daughter and make the mad dash back home to rescue pets and what valuables and essentials that we could. So, you know, I had the experience of believing that I was prepared for everything, except I just hadn't planned for where I was actually going to be when the disaster hit. Another, I think, important learning from this too is in an emergency, timing really is everything. Once I had gotten home that evening and we had packed the car with all the things we were going to take, and I'd sent another daughter off to safety, I stayed at the house until it became clear that that evacuation was now mandatory. And when that warning went out, I left the house probably within 5 minutes of getting the warning. two things to note here. One of the things that you need to be prepared for when an emergency happens is that despite all your preparations, you're going to make mistakes. And in my case, I had done everything pretty perfectly by the book up until the last minute. But I had planned to take a back road out of town. We live in a country area, and the roads can get congested quite quickly if there's a lot of traffic on the road. Jumping in the car, adrenaline running, on the phone, calling family and friends, trying to make sure, check in with people, make sure they were getting out too. Muscle memory just took over, and it ended up finding myself at the main artery out of town. I just had forgotten to take that back route that I was expecting to. For a while there, it looked like I was not going to be allowed to get off of my little on-ramp onto that main artery because everybody was panicked. Fortunately, someone eventually did slow down and let me on. But the learning there was, even though I'd done everything exactly right up until that point, that one goof in the steps I was taking kind of put everything else I had done correctly before in jeopardy. The other thing I wanted to reiterate here is, as I said, I left about 5 minutes after the warning went out. I have friends who it took maybe an extra half hour, 45 minutes for them to get in the car and begin to get out of town. They ended up having to turn around and go back to just ride things out in their homes because that artery out of town had become gridlocked. Sometimes minutes will really make all the difference.
That's such a powerful lesson there. And by the way, just for the listeners at home, I want to reiterate something here. Adam is not one of these tin hat preppers with a nuclear bunker dug down 200 feet behind his house. It's really just about setting sensible, prudent preparedness measures for whatever life could throw at you, whether it's a banking crisis, whether it is a natural disaster like fire or earthquake. It's just prudent preparedness, right?
I appreciate that distinction, Victor. Yes, exactly. At Peak Prosperity, we look at a lot of risks in the economy and in our energy systems and whatnot. And there are some scary trends out there that have us, concerned for certain permutations the future may take. But unlike sort of the doomsday prepper crowd that is all about bunkers and stored food and defense measures and all that, we take a much more optimistic view of the future. Our general thrust is basically rediscovering a lot of ways to live life that probably your grandparents would have just thought of as normal. Make an awful lot of sense in our lives, both in terms of giving us that resilience we're talking about, but also being life enhancing. So, a closeness to nature, sourcing more of your calories from your local food shed for more food security, becoming more involved in your community so that you're providing help to those who need it, but in times of need, you're getting help from those as well. These are all things that are just smart to do. And like I said, even if the next 50 years look exactly like the past 50 years, these are things that are enhancing to your quality of life, getting into better shape, eating healthier, being more engaged and valued in your community. Those are all great things. But if we end up having some of these dislocations that you just mentioned, a major economic slowdown or a stock market crisis, if oil prices somehow spike back up to $150 a barrel or higher, these are all things that are going to give you an outsized protective value to that.
That resonates really strongly with me. In fact, one of the comparisons that I make is comparing the North American lifestyle to the lifestyle in Europe. And my wife and I just spent 3 months in Europe living on board our sailboat. And very quickly, we managed to develop relationships in the local community that were unusual for us, but normal for them. And it was so wonderful. If I didn't have a car that particular week because I hadn't rented a car and I needed a drive to pick up some supplies for the boat, I could easily get that arranged simply by virtue of having developed relationships. And we don't think that way in North America.
We don't, and we don't even think that way when we're designing our standard of living here. So, in North America, the car still reigns supreme. Most towns and living arrangements for folks out in suburban sprawl, they're not walkable the way that they are in Europe. The way that life there is designed is really designed much more for a pedestrian lifestyle. And of course, that's because folks used to meet in the town center, and that was the nexus for relationship and commerce. And we just don't have that same arrangement here in North America.
Absolutely. Now, with the mention of the name Sonoma County, one of the images that comes to mind for a lot of people is, oh my goodness, what's happening to all the wineries? What's happening to all the vineyards? Are we going to see the price of wine go up? What have you been hearing from the neighbors in terms of obviously there's a lot of acreage that's been lost. Some of that for sure is agricultural acreage. What's been the impact?
Yes. So the data is still coming in, and for certain there are wineries that have been lost. Several of which we know the property owners personally. So it is very sad. My understanding at this point in time is that a greater percentage of the acreage in this most recent fire, the Kincaid fire, really was more open space, grassland, and we have not lost as many vineyards as we lost 2 years ago. So I wouldn't be predicting a tremendous price spike, tremendously notable price spike in Northern California wines at this time. So I'm happy to say that. If I could, though, Victor, I'd like to just make a quick note, though. I've written a bit of my observations of these experiences at our website, peakprosperity.com, and anybody who's interested can go read my most recent 2 articles there, which are really sort of sharing some of the lessons learned, a bit of which I shared earlier, but I also get pretty specific into the resources that proved most valuable to the nearly 200,000 folks that were forced to evacuate during this time period. And those resources are, I think, pretty universal in terms of their application to any sort of natural disaster. So I just want to put that seed in people's ears that if you're listening to this conversation, take a moment to just ask yourself, all right, given where I live, what's the most likely type of disaster that's going to happen? Is it fire? Is it flood? Is it hurricane? Is it tornado? Is it blizzard? Is it prolonged power outage? Whatever it might be. And, ask yourself, if that were to happen today, with little advance notice, how prepared am I to deal with being mandatorily evacuated for an undisclosed period of time? And I would venture to say probably most people are going to, if they're honest with themselves, they're going to answer that question, probably not as prepared as I'd like to be. And I don't necessarily want to go down that list on this podcast. That might take a little bit too long, but I did just want to put it out there that if folks are interested in learning what was most valuable for us, we've got a pretty well distilled list there. I do want to give a shout out to the local authorities here in Northern California, particularly CAL FIRE and the sheriff's system. I think one of the reasons why this fire was so less destructive and certainly had less loss of life was the benefit we had this time was time. A big part of that was the increased conservatism with the local authorities at the first sign of danger, alerting the community, keeping the community informed, and probably erring on the side of caution more than not, telling folks to get out just in case the worst were to happen. And yes, it's inconvenient to make almost 250,000 people leave their homes for a couple of days, but the alternative, which is keeping people in their homes too long, I'll certainly take the former over the latter.
Absolutely. I love that. I mean, just think about the logistics. We're talking about 3 major NFL stadiums worth of people being moved out all at the same time. That's a huge logistic problem. You're talking about roadways that are typically designed to handle 40, 50,000 cars in a day. And now you're going to try and jam that volume in a couple of hours. The roads simply can't do that. Queuing theory says that the delays, once the traffic stops, the delays become exponential. And so it's really a logistics nightmare at that point to move that number of people out in a very short period of time.
Very true. And I think what worked well this time is I think we had something like 36 hours of evacuation warning in different parts of the county. People were encouraged to leave then. And so the nice part was it wasn't a single moment in time where they told all 200,000 people to leave. They were really encouraging, leading up until the mandatory notice. And by that time, the notice became mandatory. People were expecting it at that point in time. So again, kudos to them. One other thing I want to underscore is there's the unexpected out there. And obviously having a natural emergency happen in your area, that's unexpected. But these fires were coincident with PG&E, that's our electrical and gas utility out here, the surrounding counties of where we live. That's because they knew that these dry conditions were coming and they wanted to keep the power lines dark just to minimize anything that could spark a fire. And of course, if anyone's been following the Kincaid fire, that was actually caused by a spark due to a malfunction during the shutdown that PG was was implementing. So even their plan to make things safer actually made things more dangerous. But their forced blackouts, the unintended consequence of that is once the fire got large enough where folks had to evacuate, we were all evacuating to places in the surrounding area that also had no power. So even if you've prearranged a safe place to evacuate to, a lot of people found themselves in places where the ATMs weren't working, the traffic lights weren't working, there was no running water or hot water. And it really did compound the inconvenience for people. I mean, again, spending a couple of days, by lantern somewhere is a lot better than, staying in your house and having it burned down. But the point I want to underscore there is if there's something that you need to plan on in your emergency plans, is that they're not going to go according to your exact plan. There's always going to be wrenches there in the mix. And in this one, those rolling blackouts were a big wrench.
That's a great point. I'm glad you brought that up. Here in Ottawa last year, we had 4 tornadoes that came through the core of the city, and I got stranded in New York City. At that time, the flights were canceled, and when I came back the following day, because of the power outages, what would have been a 30-minute drive from the airport to my house took an hour and a half because of the blackouts. The fact that there were simply the traffic lights were not working extended the travel time for, I'll say, really no good reason. And in an emergency situation, that's something that's often present. You cannot count on the travel times that you're used to because of those power outages. And I'm glad you mentioned that because it's one of those things that's real.
Very true. Very true. So, I think just to make things actionable for your audience here, if you've got the time and the interest, you can read those 2 recent articles on the front page of peakprosperity.com. I go into a little bit more detail about what we're talking about. We also have a guide on our website. If you go to peakprosperity.com/WSID, those initials are an acronym for What Should I Do? That is our larger online resilience guide, which is broken up into a number of steps. But step 0 in that guide is a pretty exhaustive list of all the things that you would want to have in place in your house to make yourself fully prepared for the types of conditions that we're talking about that come up during an unexpected emergency from a natural disaster. So anybody looking for, a real take me by the hand and just tell me what types of product solutions, preparation steps I should be taking, that's a pretty good free resource.
Well, thank you, Adam. Thank you for sharing that. And, the folks at Peak Prosperity, Chris Martinson, Adam Taggart, are kindred spirits. We get together several times a year and always enjoy the time that we spend together. And they're real thought leaders in this entire arena of what to do to set up your life to have a great life. Doesn't matter what's happening in your environment around you. And so definitely go check things out at peakprosperity.com and peakprosperity.com/WSID. What should I do? Thank you for joining us, Adam. Thank you for sharing your firsthand account of what happened. And for the listeners at home, have an awesome rest of your weekend. Go make some great things happen, and we'll talk to you again tomorrow.